So to get started this evening, I wanted to talk a little bit about our world in which we live in today. And so much of our modern world leads us to look down. So when you show up at a place like this is an image of Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, or at least I hope it is, Todd, because
hmm
it's described as one. So much of our modern world, though, leads us not to look up at what's around us, but to look down. Cell phones and tablets. When people often in the past had spare moments to kill, they wouldn't look down, they would look up and around at the world that was around them. Today, I don't know about you, but for me, certainly, if I have a spare moment, the first place that I tend to look is at my cell phone. I look down at that cell phone. And maybe cell phones don't look like this picture on your screen anymore, the old flip phones that we may remember. My father just transitioned from a flip phone to a smartphone last year. So they are still around, folks. But most of them look like these little mini computers, these smartphones that we carry around in our pockets today. And whether we live in the middle of an urban center and are visiting places like Slater Mill, or we're visiting that is truly kind of wilderness, like Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, often the first thing that we do when we get to a place and we get settled in that place is to look down. We look down to pull up our camera on our phone. We look down to look up directions. We look down to post on Instagram or any other social media pictures, the beautiful pictures that we've taken. And I wonder oftentimes when we do that, what do we miss in the process? What do we not see when we look down at something like our cell phone? I grew up in a relatively rural area, and I know that that is all based upon, circumstances, right? Me defining it as rural, certainly not as rural as certain parts of the country. But I did grow up in a relatively rural area in southeastern Massachusetts. And I can remember as a kid walking outside at night and looking up at the sky and seeing a lot of stars in the sky and seeing, satellites orbiting, planets, the moon, and I didn't think much of the fact that I could see so many stars in the sky. That was until I was a teenager. And I visited Boston one night with a friend. And we were walking down the streets of Boston, and we were walking by one of my favorite pieces of architecture in all of Boston, Trinity Church in Boston. Beautiful piece of architecture. And at that moment, the church steeple caused me to look up. And as I looked up at the sky, it was dark outside. It was totally dark. But on a clear night, I could only see a few stars in the sky. It was really my first exposure to what I'm going to call severe light pollution. Light pollution is the presence of unwanted, inappropriate, or excessive artificial lighting that disrupts or affects the natural world around us. I also remember my first night that I spent working at Arches National Park. And that night at our beautiful Arches National Park in Moab, Utah, I walked out of government housing, which was located inside of the park. It was around 11 p.m. Now, mind you, Arches is an international dark sky park, noted for its dark sky and the beautiful vistas that you can see at night. And as I looked up at the sky, I was stunned by how many stars I could see. Heck, I could even see the Milky Way. The first time in my life I had actually seen the Milky Way in person. And I was struck in that moment because it made me realize that the night sky at my childhood home made me feel like I was standing in the middle of Boston compared to the night sky that I saw in Arches National Park. No wonder our ancestors cared so much about the heavens. How small you feel standing in a place like that and confronted with the vastness of the universe. Of the three tribes that were the first inhabitants of the Blackstone River Valley, the Narragansett, the Nipmuc, and the Wampanoag peoples, the sky played a key role in their communities and in their culture. One, the Wampanoag, literally the word Wampanoag, which is from the Algonquian language, translates to people of the first light. And you can see in the seal of the Mashpee Wampanoag here, the sun rising over the horizon. In our part of southern New England, the sun would rise first over the Wampanoag peoples every day. With the first English colonizers, the sky and what was above them still played an important role. I'm always drawn to a story in 1684 when up at Harvard College at the time, eventually Harvard University, canceled, postponed their commencement ceremony in 1684 because there was an eclipse of the sun. It made the officials at Harvard College feel uneasy about what omen it might bring, so they postponed their commencement. As time goes on, though, an industrialization really settles in the Blackstone River Valley. Many mill workers started to work long days in front of machines, 10 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, looking down at a machine. But in a time before cell phones and other things, in that spare time, they often would look up and around at the world around them. And the sky and the objects in the sky still played a key role in their lives. The sun played a key role in lighting the interior of many mills. And whenever mill workers weren't working, they tried to spend as much time as they could in the outside, in the world, the natural world that was around them. Certain elements of mill construction, even, are intended to draw one's perspective upward. A bell tower, for example, is a great example of this. Not only was the bell tower a symbolic and literal timekeeper in a mill village, but it was often the tallest structure in a mill community. Standing in the shadow of a bell tower would make one feel small in many ways in the face of industrial power that mill represented. And certainly that bell tower, that bell itself, representing the power that the mill owner had over the people that worked there and the time that they spent in those mills. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to have my eyes drawn up as well to the bell tower as our facilities and maintenance crew did a really cool thing. They restored our bell tower, the bell in the cupola of the bell tower, which hasn't been there for about a year. The carriage that the bell sits on had experienced some serious rot and deterioration. So our maintenance and facilities crew did some critical repair work, rebuilding elements. And now, once again, as of yesterday, I got to look up and watch this work happen. The bell is once again in the cupola of our bell tower at Old Slater Mill. So if you visit us this summer, once again, you can hear that bell ring, but eyes being drawn up towards that bell tower. Not only did people look up, but people also tried to literally go up in the Blackstone River Valley. Pictured on your screen here is a man by the name of Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard, a Worcester native, would conduct the first successful liquid-fueled rocket launch in the United States in the Blackstone River Valley in Auburn, Massachusetts in March of 1926. A step towards humans not only looking up, but moving up, leaving our own atmosphere and eventually moving into space. But with this industrialization also came pollution in all types, including light pollution. As artificial lighting became more powerful and widespread, its long-term effects on what we could see when we looked up, especially at night, changed. By the mid-20th century, the Blackstone River Valley was far from a place that could be deemed a wilderness, and any semblance of a night sky, like those who had come before us had seen, was slowly fading away. But a place where the night sky and the natural world remains relatively untouched by human hands to this day is Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. So we are very lucky to be joined by Todd Smith, the Chief of Interpretation at Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, as our guest this evening. Todd, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark, and welcome to everybody. Please do feel free to post in the chat any questions that you have as we go along, and then there will be time for us to answer some questions, I think, afterward. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And start. Okay. Can everybody see that all right?
Yep.
Okay. So this is just kind of a brief introduction to Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. We are the second largest in terms of area. We're the second largest national park, um, and the largest is of course Wrangell St. Elias, which is south of us and is almost twice the size of Gates of the Arctic. Actually, it's a remarkable place. It was established as a park only in 1980, and it's actually part of a larger complex. So we actually are part of a complex, kind of administratively, but also in other ways as well. We share ecosystems with with another very large preserve called Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve, which is near to the Canadian border. And we're part of a series of ecosystems stretching from the Alaska Yukon border almost all the way to the Bering Sea. That includes some of the most beautiful mountains, including almost the entire Brooks Range, and eight wild rivers, and like I said, stretching all the way to the Bering Sea. It's a remarkable place. All right. So this is just kind of intended to give you a little bit of an overview of the park, and we're going to talk more about the park as we go on. We'll get a little bit more in depth, but just some facts here. Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, we'll call it GAR, which is our four-letter Park Service code. It was created to preserve and protect the 8.4 million acres of diverse Arctic ecosystems of Alaska's Central Brooks Range, and it is considered to be the premier wilderness park in the National Park Service system, and serves as the headwaters for actually six wild rivers. It is the least visited national park in the United States, with about 11,000 official visitors in 2023. I was telling Mark as we began that we actually have a lot fewer than that. We probably have more like probably 4,000 visitors per year. And it was established as part of as a national park and preserve in 1980. At the very end of the Carter administration, December of 1980, as part of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. This created a number of parks in Alaska, and created actually most of the national parks in Alaska, and made places like Denali from a monument into a national park as well. So this map kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of just how big the park is and where it is in Alaska exactly. So the park itself is about 300 miles north of Fairbanks. And I'm actually in Fairbanks today. That's where my office is. And then in the summertime, I'm all over central and northern Alaska. Gates of the Arctic is about 100 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And it's about 8.5 million acres in size, or about 13,000 square miles. And it's a little bit larger than Maryland. So that kind of gives you some idea of just how big this park is. And you can see on the map that we're just a small part of Alaska. So it gives you a really good idea of how big Alaska is. Like I said, we don't have a lot of visitors in the park. There is only one way there are three ways to get into the park, but there's one way that is by far the easiest, and that's taking a flight into the park. So there are a couple of places where people can fly into the park from our gateway communities, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Arrogetch Peaks here, just to kind of give you a sampler of what things look like in Gates of the Arctic, is probably the iconic view of the park, and definitely the most famous and most heavily visited place in the park as well. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So when we go into the park, when our backcountry rangers and our volunteers go into the area that we just call the Arrogetch, this is where we usually go. Now, we also have scientists that are going all over the place. They're going to every corner of the park and into some of the other parks, Noatak as well, that border Gates of the Arctic. And we have in our office here in Fairbanks, we have a number of wildlife biologists, we have plant biologists, botanists, we have archaeologists, we have historians. So there is a whole lot of scientific and social science research being done in Gates of the Arctic and other parklands in the Brooks Range in northern Alaska. Our staff are based in a few places. Coldfoot, Alaska, which some of you may have seen in one of those what's it called, ice road trucker shows. Usually they don't show our visitor center; they just show the truck stop. So we have staff there in the Arctic Interagency Visitor Center, which we share with our sister agencies, Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Bettles, Alaska, which is a former military airfield where probably most of our visitors who actually go into the park fly in and out of Bettles, Alaska. And a place that used to actually be part of the park, but no longer is. It's kind of surrounded like an enclave within the park, Anaktuvuk Pass, which is a village almost right in the middle of Gates of the Arctic, and we have a small visitor contact station there. Now, as far as visiting the park, traveling Gates of the Arctic can be tremendously difficult with no trails or facilities of any kind. I kind of chose this particular brand of wildlife, the mosquitoes. It just gives you an idea of some of the difficulties. We do encourage people who travel, especially if they're in very, very small groups. If you're traveling in Gates of the Arctic, a lot of people do carry firearms. A lot of our non-commissioned employees, most of us have to qualify with firearms to safely travel in Gates of the Arctic and Yukon Charlie as well, because of primarily because of bears. Now, this is different than most national parks in that visitors here have to really be completely self-reliant in this really remarkable wilderness area. There is nothing to fall back on with the exception of a satellite phone or an inReach. That's really the only way that you're probably going to get rescued. And even that is heavily dependent upon the weather, which can be pretty tough almost any time of year. So most of the people, the vast majority of people that visit Gates of the Arctic, if they're staying for more than one day, then they're usually quite well prepared. And the payoff for that is that when you visit Gates of the Arctic, you are likely to enjoy almost complete solitude. So if one goes there for a 2 or 3 week trip, it's likely that one will see probably no one. If you want to see absolutely nobody on the trip, you would probably choose to visit a more remote part of the park, and you are almost certain to see no other people. And while most visits do occur in the summer months, viewing of the aurora during northern Alaska's long winter nights is drawing more and more visitors to Gates of the Arctic, and even more so its gateway communities. So winter here lasts for a very, very long time. It really starts in Gates of the Arctic. Winter really starts in earnest in September. It starts snowing in September, sometimes even in late August. And it can continue to snow well into May, and in some parts of the park, even into June. So winter really is it's the norm, not the exception. So that short period of time when visitors are here in the summer months, in the gloriously beautiful summer months that we have up here, they don't really see the aurora. They don't see the night sky. They're still looking up. It would be pretty difficult to visit Gates of the Arctic and not be looking up. And it helps that there's no cell phone coverage anywhere in the park. But going in the summer means that you are not going to see those night skies. You're not going to see the aurora. the aurora in that part of Alaska and most of Alaska is really only visible from late August through about now. We're just coming to the very end of the aurora season right now. The night skies are really important in so many different ways. I think in some ways that people who visit from the lower 48 and from other parts of the world where they don't have access to seeing the aurora, it's on a lot of people's bucket list to come up and see it. And I think that people come up to see it kind of for some of the same reasons that people come to see the wilderness and come to experience the wilderness. It's something, and Mark was talking about this earlier. He was talking about looking up and seeing that beautiful starlit sky, and when he was at Arches, seeing the Milky Way for the first time, and then going to Boston and seeing extreme light pollution. I grew up just outside of Seattle, and when I was a kid, it was the same thing. We could see the Milky Way, we could see the stars. When I go and visit my mother there now, it's total light pollution, and you can't see anything. People have a craving for the dark skies. I think a lot of people feel really fulfilled when they get up here, and they not only get to see great stars on nights when the aurora is not when there's not a lot of auroral activity, but on the nights when there is a lot of auroral activity, you don't have to look to the horizon. You don't have to search for it. The aurora is all around you, and it's an absolutely remarkable thing. Now, of course, dark skies, the importance of dark skies goes far, far beyond just something to do while you're in Alaska, or something to do while you're in Greenland or Iceland or Finland. The importance of dark skies extends to almost everything. Light pollution affects not only the ecosystems that we really treasure, the natural places, the beautiful public lands that we have all over our country and all over the world. They affect us as well. So if we have dark skies, there are a lot of things that aren't interrupted. So bird life isn't interrupted as much. Marine life in places in cities where there are lights shining down into water, the marine life there is affected, and human beings as well. Mark was talking about looking down at our cell phones. Well, the light from cell phones can affect your sleep. We know that now. And a lot of people recommend that you not view certain kinds of light. Darkness is actually a good thing, and it's something that human beings need. And we certainly have a lot of darkness in the winter here in Alaska. We're lucky in that way. Oops. So I've put the website for our park up on the screen here, and I wanted to kind of just give you a brief overview of the park so you can see some pictures of what it looks like and what some of the ideas of it are. The idea of wilderness, the idea of dark skies, the idea of going back to something that really predates the Industrial Revolution, and what Charles Dickens called called them the Satanic Mills in both the United States and England in the middle part, early middle part of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution changed a lot of things, and even the post-industrial world that they say we live in now. It seems like more and more places are lit all the time. There are always things going on, and there's been this important movement within a lot of groups, a lot of communities, national parks, other entities, to really go back to a time when the skies were darker and things were a little bit more natural. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Todd. It seems like an amazing place. And I cannot wait, hopefully someday, to certainly visit there. Um, People say that we're a land management agency, and you talk
Mm-hmm.
about the vastness of the wilderness that exists there. And before you were mentioning how, there are no formalized trails in the park, and there was really an
Right.
attempt not to build infrastructure in the park.
Mhm.
So, what does management of this place, or I guess maybe not so much management, look like, and what are the results of that for someone visiting the place?
Sure. So, um, the reality of Gates of the Arctic is that there are there are not trails that have been built there, but there are social trails. Um, when one goes into a subalpine environment or an alpine environment in a place like Colorado, say above 12 or 13,000 feet, or farther north up in Washington, like at 5 or 6,000 feet, the environment's very sensitive there. One step in the wrong direction can kill a number of plants. It's kind of like that in parts of the Arctic as well. And so if people are, we give people a backcountry orientation that they're required to partake of before they go into Gates. And one of the things that we teach people is to camp on hard surfaces, to camp in rocky areas. But if there is a disturbed area, camp on that disturbed area. If it's been disturbed, then camp there. Don't create a new disturbance. Also studying the management in in Alaska is very, very heavy on science as well. So we're kind of at the forefront of studying the ways that the climate is changing and what sorts of effects that has on the landscape and also on the people who've lived here for 12,000 or more years and continue to live here. Um, so a lot of science, a lot of patrols, observation, and a lot of education. That's really how we manage the land here.
And that is such a major difference than visiting a place like Yellowstone. Like I think people
Yeah.
visit a place like Yellowstone or Arches or Zion, and they're going to our national parks to not only enjoy that natural beauty, but also that sense of going back to a place that is not industrialized or not built
Mm-hmm.
up. And yet you go to these places and all that you see is cars and other people and full parking lots, right? And that infrastructure.
Right.
So it does sound, and not to say that those parks don't have wilderness areas where you can get away from all that, but it does sound that certainly Gates of the Arctic is much more an investment, it sounds like, but worth the investment if you're looking for that solitude.
Yeah, it is, and you know it is an expensive proposition. Unfortunately, just getting to Alaska is expensive, but then getting from Fairbanks to Gates of the Arctic is there are three ways to do it. The fastest way, obviously, is taking a flight. One can also one can also float in, but you have to be pretty experienced, and that's still logistically going to be fairly expensive. And then there are also ways to hike into the park as well. But it's an investment in time, in preparation, and and resources. So unfortunately, we have this amazing wilderness area, but it's not accessible to enough people, I think, which sounds kind of ironic, but yeah.
It's almost the inverse of, that balance of enjoyment, preservation, right? It almost, usually that balance is more towards people loving parks, if you will, to death,
Right.
as they say, versus this is kind of tilted in the other way. So that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition. There was a question in the chat, which I kind of found
Mm-hmm.
interesting. It's a little bit more about people who work at the park and kind of,
Sure.
um, what amenities do you find, like what is it like to live in a place like Fairbanks, obviously as a community, as a city, as an established place, but
Right.
what do employees, especially backcountry rangers, like what amenities or other things are provided to try to make that experience more, I don't want to say enjoyable, but there are certain basic necessities of life. So what's that balance for people who actually work at the park?
Well, in the last, we'll say the last 20 years, a lot of there have been a lot of changes, for better or for worse. So Bettles was the headquarters for Gates of the Arctic for many years until about 12 or 13 years ago. Unfortunately, the community that's there, the school there closed, and schools are usually kind of the heart and soul of almost any community. And when the school closed, then that kind of for most people that eliminated Bettles as a place that they really felt like they could live, especially if both parents worked and there wasn't really any possibility of homeschooling. Um, so most of our employees now live in Fairbanks. Fairbanks is really not that much different than living anywhere else in the United States, with the exception of the extreme cold in the winter here. It does. I was telling you earlier that it was, in February it was minus 55 for a few days here, coldest it's been in a while. Um, in the summertime, when more of us are in uh, either in Gates of the Arctic or Yukon Charlie, which is where I am more of the time, or I spend a lot of time in both Coldfoot and Bettles as well. You have to bring everything in. You fly into Bettles, or you drive 7 or 8 hours up to Coldfoot. You bring all of your supplies with you. In Bettles, generally speaking, you want to bring as much water as you can as well, because the water up there isn't very good. So it's not a really easy place. It's very expensive to live up here, even in Fairbanks. It's housing is pretty reasonable, but anything other than that, food, everything is pretty expensive here. So, but it's a cool place. Fairbanks is a wonderful place to live. I love it. It's a great place.
A lot of parks are struggling with seasonal employment, and kind of hearing you
Mm-hmm.
describe some of this stuff is making me wonder about like recruitment of people. Is this a park that you really find that the people who go there really want to be there because of the resource? It doesn't seem like, there's other things that we have enough time and we have all the amenities that you could want being in the middle of a city around you. And we have enough time finding people and attracting people. What do you find that draws people who work there to the place?
Yeah, it's the resource for sure. There's really very little else to do. Now, I talked a little bit about some of the difficulties of working in a place like this. But there are a couple of things that have really helped. Number one, you know, one can get online and order supplies from wherever, and they're delivered. Typically, they're delivered even to fly-in communities. They're delivered without any more expense. So if you're shopping at Amazon or Walmart or wherever you're shopping, Costco, they'll ship it to you. That's helped. And then more recently, and this is certainly not I'm not, giving my endorsement, but the new satellite internet, Starlink up here has completely changed. We had a couple of college students who couldn't register for classes from Bettles because the phone system up there didn't work. For well, it still doesn't work very well. It's been several years we've not been able to get it fixed properly. But now we have Starlink up there, and our internet up there is as fast as it is almost anywhere. So there are some things that have changed. There are certain amenities that people do expect now. I think internet is one of them, and it seems to take us a while, but we don't really have too much of a problem recruiting seasonals for those places. Now, we have a visitor center here in Fairbanks as well. It's very hard to get seasonals here because we don't have any housing here in Fairbanks, and it's pretty expensive to get a 3-month lease somewhere. So
Mhm. We can relate to that being in the
yeah, I
Grand
bet.
Providence
I
area
bet.
with that. Certainly, that's a
Yep.
issue that we have with the lack of government housing in our park and just the cost of living in the area as well. Kind of transitioning from employee experiences to a little bit of the wildlife. There was a question in here about
Mhm.
bears and
Yeah.
specifically if bear spray works or not. And you mentioned that employees have to, even if they're not a commissioned a law enforcement officer
Mhm.
carrying firearms and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, not just about whether or not bear spray is effective, but a little bit more about the bear species that may live in the park. Are we talking
Sure.
grizzly bears, polar
Yeah.
bears? And
Yeah. We don't have polar bears. We have mostly brown bears in Gates of the Arctic and in Yukon Charlie. We do have some black bears as well. Um, I I feel much more secure with bear spray than I do with a firearm. But I don't have a whole lifetime of using firearms, so I'm a little, that's my whatever. And I've been using bear spray for a long time. I worked at Yellowstone, and it is very, very effective. Bear spray is. It can potentially be used for other animals as well. One of the most dangerous animals. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of moose up in Gates of the Arctic. You're a little bit far north for that, but within Alaska, the moose and muskox, along with the polar bear, are probably the three most dangerous animals. And muskox are extremely aggressive, and I'm not sure how well bear spray would work on an animal charge that big, charging at you that fast. So in that case, I would probably rather have a firearm than have bear spray. But that's a great question.
On the topic of wildlife, you showed the picture of the mosquitoes.
Yeah,
And I worked at Big Cypress for a short period of time.
yeah,
And those were worse mosquitoes than I think I ever saw in Florida's swamp.
yeah, yeah.
So what leads to that environment that in the summer months, I'd imagine is when this is happening, that there are that many mosquitoes
Mm.
in the Arctic territory?
Yeah, that's a great question. And even in subarctic areas like Fairbanks as well, we're 150 miles, I think, south of the Arctic Circle here. There's so much permafrost in Alaska, and just to give you an example, I had a fence put in my backyard last year, and it couldn't be installed until July because the first few feet of ground were frozen until mid-July last year. So you have all this permafrost, and in some cases not quite permafrost, and it melts. A lot of it melts, and a lot of the land here is just really, really swampy. And plus, we have a lot of like black spruce swamps, a lot of wetlands all over Alaska, just perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and you know, combined with a lot of wildlife as well. So yeah,
Pretty crazy. You think that you're going that far north to get away from mosquitoes, and you're confronted with.
yeah, it's funny. I think what everybody kind of hopes for is that some nice warm weather and then a really deep freeze, but it doesn't work that way. They come back. They always come back. There's a nice period of time in May until early June, at least in Fairbanks, and in some of our gateway communities, where we really don't have mosquitoes for a very short period of time, and we have beautiful sunny weather. But then they come out and they're here until September, sometimes even early October. So
There was another question in the chat regarding kind of your visitation, which you already kind of
mhm.
hit upon, the fact that most people never actually visit the park itself, but
Right.
visit the visitor center, and kind
Mhm.
of what effect may that have on your funding, if at all?
Well, I mean, we're I think they're still called in the lower 48. We don't call them this up here in Alaska, but we're a 20% park. We don't actually charge fees at all. So our funding is done a little bit differently. you know, we do our visitor center in Fairbanks is it's not part of Gates of the Arctic. It's kind of a, I won't bore you with the administrative details. It's actually an interagency visitor center, but the Park Service runs it. Um, we probably we see a lot of visitors here in Alaska are in Fairbanks, and we prepare them for experiences at Gates of the Arctic, Yukon Charlie, Denali, uh, Kobuk, Cape Krusenstern, all these places that are wilderness areas. We prepare them in people for that experience in Fairbanks. So that facility gets actually pretty good money because of all the scientists that we have here and all the projects they're doing. They're constantly getting grants and um, so even if our what we call our ONPS, are basically our operating funds, even if they don't seem like they're that much, and of course everybody wants more money, don't they? But we've been very fortunate in the number of grants that we've been able to get, and also the other thing to remember about there may be only a few thousand people that go into Gates of the Arctic every year, but the carrying capacity there is not much more than that. I don't know that we could handle many more visitors than we get actually within the park, because the whole point of it is for it to be this incredibly beautiful, largely untouched place. And if more people go there, we believe it or not, people leave trash behind. Every year we do a variety of cleanups there. We pick up trash. You would never dream that people would leave trash up there, but they do. So all the problems that every other place has, we have them in slightly smaller bits. But the funding thing, I suppose if we had twice as many visitors, we might get a little bit more funding, but nobody wants that. Nobody wants that kind of impact on an extremely fragile landscape here.
Right. That's something that we talk to often at Slater Mill, the building behind me here in the picture.
Mm-hmm.
It's a historic building, 230 plus years old. The reality is the building itself can only take so many people throughout the course of a day
Yeah,
visiting it. The more people that go into the building, the more likely people are to touch 230-year-old exposed wooden beams in the building. That can lead to, difficulties in preservations. That is something that is a difficult balancing act sometimes, though,
right.
right? The building can only take so much. Gates of the Arctic can only take so much. And you want to welcome more people, but sometimes it's in the best interest of preservation, not to limit visitation, but there is a reality that the more people that visit, the more difficult it becomes to preserve certain places.
That's
Um,
right.
so there is another question too about
Mm-hmm.
climate change, something that we've kind of been experiencing firsthand here in the Blackstone River Valley with increased flooding events as a result of a changing climate. And the question specifically is related to Gates with the melting of permafrost.
Yep.
How much has that been happening over the course of the last few years?
Yeah. So there is a long term. We have climate scientists here, which is great. They've been tracking, gosh, since the late '80s. They've been tracking, and they're at Anaktuvuk Pass. I think there are weather records that go back probably to the early '50s, shortly after the community was established. There's a clear pattern of it getting significantly warmer, and it's you know it, we notice it in things like you're probably familiar. Most of the people here are probably familiar with a lot of the things like the pine bark beetle all over the western United States. That's causing an increased incidence of big fires as these. It's not cold enough to kill the beetle off, or enough of them anyway, and so they are. They're living longer. They're destroying trees. We have that with spruce trees up here. There's a spruce bark beetle, and it's just not cold enough up here anymore to kill it off, and so we're losing a lot more spruce trees, and that problem is marching north. And is really right at the at the gates of gates right now. Permafrost is definitely melting. Phyllis, thank you for that question. And one of the results in both urban and rural areas of all over Alaska is that houses are subsiding. So um, there are a lot of people that live in Fairbanks, for instance, and if you go farther north, it's just as bad or worse. And the foundation of their house just gets destroyed because the ground subsides. It might subside over a period of 10 years. It might subside several feet in one area and not in the other area. And all around Fairbanks, you can see houses that are permanently badly damaged because of that. That's one of the effects of the climate changing.
Effects on human infrastructure as well as the natural world.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Um, there's another question in the chat regarding indigenous peoples
Mhm.
in the park areas and whether they are still there.
Yes, yeah, they are. So one of the other reasons, national parks in Alaska are a little bit different. And I don't want to go too deep into this because it's like a 5 day conversation. But so Anilka, which I mentioned in my brief little slideshow, uh, the law that established so many of the parks here in Alaska, we actually have a mandate that's a little bit stronger than it is in the lower 48 to work very, very closely with tribes and villages throughout Alaska to um, engage in what we call co-stewardship. So um, this is the land of the Athabascan people, of the Inupiat people, and dozens of other tribes and villages and groups of indigenous peoples. They've been here since time immemorial, and they're here now, and they will continue to be here. They continue to use the land, and we are trying really hard um, to support their communities as they have been supporting the resource and supporting the environment for millennia. Um, and that history hasn't always been great. I do. Um, I've learned to develop a little bit of a thick skin and realize it's not personal when I walk into a meeting and I'm called a colonizer. I get it. I understand, and I'm learning to I'm learning to listen better. I'm learning to free myself of my own biases and my own experience in some cases, and just learn from the people that have been here for thousands of years that understand this place that like I never will. So
In the Blackstone River Valley, we've recently completed a general management plan, or are about to complete a general management plan, and part of that was a tribal roundtable, where the park was able to engage with the three local tribes, that
that's
called
great.
Blackstone River Valley home. And so that process, that communication, is starting to get started in earnest, which I think is important, especially in our area, where
Mm-hmm.
colonizers and their descendants did their best to say that. The indigenous people were no longer here, that
Yep.
recognize that even in the northeastern United States, they are still here and they still live here
Yep.
in this place. So opening up those communications, I think that's important for parks all across the country, right? That open
It is.
communication. Thank you for answering that question.
Sure.
My last question for you is sounds like it's kind of a slightly difficult place to visit, but an awesome place to visit.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are any insider tips, tricks, anything that you can give to someone who goes, I really want to visit Gates of the Arctic this summer? What is an insider tip or trick that you can give us to make our visit that much more special?
You know, this really is this is a park where we don't have a lot of insider tricks. honestly. Like if you ask me that same question about Yellowstone, about Mount Rainier, about a million different places, I can give you that. Here, it's really all about preparation. It's about preparation and planning, knowing what your abilities are, knowing what your certainly what your limits are. Um, Now that being said, there are ways if you are very skilled with navigation. There are ways to enter the park pretty inexpensively. You can take a shuttle from Fairbanks for not that much money up to Wiseman, which is just north of Coldfoot. And from Wiseman, it's about a 3 mile hike inside the boundary of Gates of the Arctic. And then a lot of people will just walk for a very long way. But you have to be pretty skilled and be in pretty great shape to be able to do that. We do see more and more people trying that on their own. Usually they're fairly successful. Um, I think I think you don't necessarily have to actually go into the park to kind of experience some of the things though that are inside the park. So the one thing I always encourage people to think about when they're talking about doing a tour of national parks is to remember that while within the boundaries of our national parks we have incredible things, we really do. But there's a little bit of John Steinbeck in me as well, and he talked in Travels with Charlie about national parks kind of being sideshows, and that they were places of extremes, and people went to see these things that were really extreme, that they weren't necessarily representative of what was in the area. There's a little bit of me that kind of agrees with that. So I think the insider tip for me would be just come up here, just come up to Alaska and experience it if you can. It is a um, and people love to go on cruises, but get off the cruise ship and come up here and visit interior Alaska. It's a life changing place. Just visiting up here is life changing.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for joining us this evening and taking the time out of your day to chat with us about Gates of the Arctic. I've learned a lot, and I have been convinced, as I often am at the end of these presentations, that I want to head up there at some point in the future and visit Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. In conclusion, folks, I just want to say that, in our world where all of us seem to look down, I want to challenge each of us to look up. Look up at the natural world around us. Look up at the soaring human architecture around us, depending on where you're located. Look up at the night sky and think about what you see now compared to what people would have seen 150 years ago. What's the same and what's different?